Welcome and thank you for joining PwC's Power and Utilities Enterprise Asset Management webinar. My name is Arun Gupta and I am the partner and leader for the Utilities Internalized Practice in Western Canada. I will be the host of today's session and joined by Mark Burns, our director in the Toronto Internal Audit Group. Your guest presenter for today is Walter Lee, director in our consulting practice, specializing in EAM for the power and utilities sector. For today's session, we will share our perspectives on some of the key industry trends, priorities, and drivers facing Canadian utilities, such as aging infrastructure, cost scrutiny, and public safety concerns, while providing insight into how utilities can get the most out of leading EAM practice and be positioned to help drive asset performance and reduce the risk. We will also talk about internal audit considerations when reviewing an EAM program, as well as discuss what utilities are doing to expand the scope and capabilities of implementing successful EAM optimization strategies. Before we commence today's session, we have a few housekeeping rules and reminders. To ensure you can hear today's webinar properly, please make sure the volume is turned all the way up on your laptop as well as on the webinar console. It is extremely important that you mute your phone or microphone throughout the presentation to avoid background interference. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question typing into the chat box on the bottom right-hand pane of your screen. We will answer questions selectively and will endeavor to answer as many of your questions as possible. There will also be a Q&A portion at the conclusion of this session for additional questions. A recording of this webinar and the slide deck will be uploaded on the PwC Canada Power and Utilities webpage in due course. For technical issues you may be experiencing, click on the help function or use the chat box feature to describe your problem. Now let me introduce you to today's presenter, Walter Lee. Walter is a director in PwC's Operations Effectiveness Practice, where he leads the enterprise asset management competency in Canada. Walter brings extensive consulting and industry experience in both the private and public sectors, with a focus on supply chain and enterprise asset management. Walter specializes in helping clients in capital-intensive, heavy industries within utilities, oil and gas, mining, and consumer packaged goods, with reducing total costs, increased operations, and asset effectiveness, or enable regulatory compliance, and has leveraged strategic sourcing, inventory management, work management, logistics, and technology enablement to improve operational effectiveness. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. I would now like to pass things over to Walter.
Okay, thank you, Arun. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take the next 45 minutes or so to introduce the topic of enterprise asset management in the utilities industry. A very topical and timely discussion, as many organizations today are putting a stronger focus on how they manage their assets in light of changing trends, priorities, and an overall desire to return more on their asset investments. We'll also take a brief look at the evolution of EAM, which is a timely subject as the new global standards, the ISO standards, were recently released. Finally, we'll focus on the risk consequences as a result of poor strategy and execution. Again, another topic of great interest in the marketplace right now. First up, let's talk about some trends and priorities we've observed in the utilities industry. On this slide here, there are four key trends that face utilities today. First off, the capacity side, we see a number of utilities thinking about the increasing demand as they consider and debate asset investment planning for both capacity expansion as well as asset end of life and or replacement. From a social and economic perspective, there's certainly increased scrutiny that stakeholders put on utilities. That was easily observed in this past winter's ice storm for those of you in southern Ontario. It certainly caused a lot of management teams to question their ability to monitor, locate, and repair their assets in critical downtime and service outages. From a technology innovation perspective, a lot of organizations are looking to better manage their maintenance, supply chain, and field workers via technology. Everything in use from global positioning systems to mobility enhancement, via tablets and smartphones, and remote asset monitoring to replace or augment manual inspections that used to take place. Within even our own client portfolio, a number of utilities are investigating new technologies like mobility and mobility enhancement, in one form or another contemplating a business case, requirement gathering, or budget planning for these new technologies. And finally, there's the regulatory angle, which again has always been a fact of life for a regulated industry. With increased consumer scrutiny comes a similar focus on reporting and the need to produce more granular and transparent reporting. Whether it be corrective action reporting to enterprise performance reporting to workforce efficiency reporting and or asset performance reporting, the list goes on. So certainly lots of focus there. Next up, the key priorities. So these trends have all made utilities rethink their strategic priorities, namely their infrastructure, their workforce, their customer perception, and even their own ability to better balance value and at what cost. That's really always the question. Utilities are placing an increased emphasis on their assets, asking how they can prevent failure and prolong asset life at the same time. Of course, the background priority is to do all this within an optimized cost and risk profile, which we'll get into in a few slides. So from a workforce perspective, utilities are always looking at ways to successfully adopt new technology so that the overall worker productivity is increased. And while it seems simple in concept, it's actually quite challenging to adopt in real life, and we've seen it firsthand. As a matter of fact, our one utility we're working with who currently is struggling to put technology into the hands of field technicians and move away from the tribal knowledge and methods and paper-based work orders, which they've been used to for decades. And I'll tell you, it's not so much the technology, but it's more of a cultural shift as opposed to the technology implementation or the technology working itself. So from a management perspective, there's certainly key priorities that revolve around risk and the balancing act of performance and cost. And again, I'll get into that in a few moments. So amid strategic initiatives to cut costs, the focus is on the life cycle cost of operating and maintaining that asset base. Priorities have certainly shifted from individual maintenance costs and focus there to the bigger picture, which is really return on investment, return on assets, as management teams examine sort of the longer planning horizons. So those are the key priorities that we certainly see coming up from the trends that we observed earlier. This next slide talks a lot about the key drivers. So given the backdrop of trends and priorities, utilities really have three levers to manage. And this is at the core of all enterprise asset management. It's how do they balance and manage risk, performance, and expenditures, or the cost to maintain. It really is a balancing act at the end of the day. Asset management execution is what allows companies to actively balance these three levers. And again, for example, if you cut operating costs, the risk profile would likely go up, no surprise. Performance may go up or down or stay the same. However, if you modify the type and frequency of maintenance activities, you're probably able to maintain the same or better risk profile with the same consistent performance and lower costs. So that's certainly the tricky part, and that's really the silver bullet that most companies are looking for. So when we get into the next section, and we'll certainly talk a little bit about that, talk about EAM in the utilities context. This next slide here, this is an excerpt from our most recent annual global survey of power and utility companies where we asked some executives, where do they see the most potential for cost and efficiency improvements in their organization? And the way you see the results, not surprisingly, all of the areas you see circled are actually founded on asset management as a key value driver. So let me explain. The first, at 73% of respondents, is actively monitoring asset performance and using data to drive more appropriate maintenance activities in order to maintain reliability and availability. That is, looking at assets, understanding how they perform, monitoring them on an active basis, and then modifying, using that information to modify how we approach maintenance activities, frequency, and type of maintenance tactics. The second one, at 68% of respondents, is really taking a closer look at capital projects and the risk profile to see if more can be done to mitigate delivery risk. And as I'll get into a little bit later on, our view of asset management is really the full life cycle of asset management, which includes capital projects. And again, I know it's a little bit contrary to how the marketplace sees it, and I'll certainly get into that in a little bit, and I'll explain reasons why. The third component, at 61% of respondents, is really leveraging asset management to focus on reliability with positive impacts or positive outcomes on customer service and uptime. Obviously, the link there is while we leverage asset management, as I mentioned before, the tactics and the frequency of what we're doing to our assets, we're looking at the reliability outcome. If we can maintain that reliability outcome at a certain cost and a certain risk profile, we've achieved our stated goals in customer service, for example. So certainly asset management plays a huge role in that respect. The final area, which is really the 60% asset risk management, is actually where the organization, what we're seeing now, a lot of organizations, they can examine risks of asset failure and the severity of outcomes. So that's a key thing there is, what is the risk of an asset failure? So what is the probability, likelihood, and what is the impact of that outcome, impact or severity of the outcome? Based on that, they model proactively the different types of maintenance tactics and maintenance activities to address that criticality. So again, if it's something that an asset fails, is there a severe outcome, i.e. loss of life, or is there a not so severe, not as critical outcome, which is, if something happens, a light burns out, for example, in the most extreme case, and they just need to replace it when the time comes. Okay, so that's really the backdrop to sort of what the industry space is looking at, and so they see a lot of room for improvement. And again, our view and our focus here is that asset management is probably the underlying root cause, or actually the area to look at in terms of making those improvements. Okay. This next slide, so I talked a lot about sort of balancing risk, cost, and performance. And organizations really have, under the asset management umbrella, this is where we start to get into sort of a bit more of the meat of it. Organizations have three broad areas that they can influence. And you'll see them right on the screen: asset management, work management, performance management. So the very first one, asset management, this is, again, taking more of a strategic view, taking the life cycle view of managing assets to achieve strategic corporate objectives. Again, asset life cycle view, beginning to end, cradle to grave, and how does it support strategic objectives in terms of return on investment, return on assets? So a key piece there. And again, this encompasses broad steps of capital planning, design, the procurement of those capital assets, the building and construction of the assets, the commissioning into operation, the actual operation and maintenance of those assets, and then finally the decommissioning, as we'll see shortly. So I've got another slide that'll talk a little bit about our perspective on sort of the life cycle. But suffice to say, asset management is the big picture view. We get into more granular view, which is work management. A big component of asset management is the maintenance side. So how do we maintain the asset base, and what's our organization who actually maintains it? What are the tools that we use? Certainly in the supply chain as well, from a materials or spares perspective, and also the purchasing side of things, i.e. purchasing materials, so that the maintenance guys have materials to work with. So that really talks to enabling effective work as opposed to efficient work, which is the other emphasis. So effective work is doing the right maintenance activities at the right time, and as I mentioned before, that's really the lever that we often see when you're balancing risk, performance, and cost, is identifying how much is too much preventive maintenance and how much is too little, and are we applying the right maintenance tactics to the right assets which carry a certain criticality or a risk profile, risk of failure profile. So that's the effective side. When we talk about the efficiency side, this is really the enabling our workforce to do things better, faster, more streamlined, more accurately. And this we see often as the enablement with tools. So again, when we get into the process and the technology side of things, we do talk a lot about identifying where work needs to be done, planning, scheduling effectively the work that needs to be done vis-a-vis your work through, dispatching those work orders to the right people, again, in the right priority, actually executing those work orders, doing the work itself, and then completing the work orders, closing the loop, because there certainly is a data and information perspective in the whole work management cycle or process. So enabling effective and efficient work is the key for work management. The third dimension is what we call performance management. Really, this is the age-old adage of if you don't measure it, you don't improve, or you can't improve it. So this one talks a lot about and deals with measuring, analyzing, reporting, and then improving key operational maintenance metrics across the network of assets. So again, it's how we look at assets, how we look at our people, how we look at the network, how we look at the enterprise, and how we roll up to the entire enterprise. How well are we performing, and is there a continuous improvement angle based on those metrics? Okay, so again, three core areas where asset management can actually influence and make that difference in terms of balancing those three things I spoke about earlier. Okay, the next section. So let me take a little time to talk about EAM and its evolution over time. I know a number of people certainly look at enterprise asset management, and some think it's asset management big picture, and on the other side, some people look at it as it's the maintenance activities. So let me use these slides here to talk a little bit about how we see things evolving. So asset management as a discipline has continuously improved over time, over the last several decades, as the chart shows. Through the early years, tactical execution was really the focus for improvement, i.e. fix it when it breaks, i.e. fix it when there's a problem, let it run to failure, as an example. But really, the recent focus, and again, when I say second and third generation, still those are many decades past, there's been an increasing focus towards management practices to start to look at things more strategically, more from a holistic perspective, and more at an integrated perspective. And again, as I get into the next series of slides, we can certainly go through that and talk through that. But in this day and age, especially if you consider the trends we spoke about and sort of the drivers and the priorities for organizations, and the regulated nature of utilities, there's a much stronger consideration for the stakeholders. I mean, when we talk about the various stakeholders, there's regulatory bodies, there's the people who work in these organizations, their personal safety, there's the consumers like you and I who use the services, who turn on our lights and turn on our gas stoves. There's certainly the environment that they need to think about. There's maintainability of the assets. There's reliability that we spoke about before from a consumer perspective. There's the analytics side of things, because now as networks get more complicated, as procedures get more complicated, as more people and our assets get more complex, there's certainly the analytics perspective. We talk a little bit about worker safety, consumer perception, corporate reputation, and so forth. So again, what you see in the third generation, it's only going to get more complex. It's only going to get more involved. And as a company starts to look at asset management and really branch out from the maintenance mindset, you're going to have to start looking at all of these different areas. So bottom line, the message here is asset management is much, much more broader than maintenance, and organizations around the world, organizations across industries are realizing this, and they're trying to figure out what's their best strategy to approach this. Okay. So this next slide here, let me take you through this. This is really how we at PwC, how we view asset management from a strategic and a holistic way. And again, it starts at the very top. Let me take you to the top left. It starts at the very top with stakeholders, both internal and external, as I had mentioned. Then there are plans and objectives for the organization to satisfy the needs of the stakeholders. So if you're a utility, you have regulatory bodies, you have government, you have consumers, you have internal shareholders, or external shareholders for that matter. Their plans and objectives to achieve a certain strategic goal, or a return on investment, or return on assets, or year-over-year growth, as some companies that we're working with today. Those plans and objectives translate roughly into 7 different areas, starting with the asset management strategy. So again, I'm taking a view of asset management here. And again, from a strategic perspective, we start to branch into asset management strategy, driven in part by what's the policy governing it, which drives through asset management specific objectives and plans, sort of in the middle on the left. So what are our objectives, and what do we want to achieve in the next 5 years, in the next 3 years, or the next year, perhaps? And what are the plans, specifically, what are the tactical plans we need to roll out to deploy our people, whether they're in the management position or whether they're in the field worker position? What do we need to do with the organization from an asset perspective? We then drive down to sort of the portfolio of our assets, and how do we manage the plan against that wide range of portfolio of assets? And the portfolio of assets really is where you'll see the circle there, where we actually look at capital projects and enterprise asset management. So from a capital projects perspective, and I believe we covered this on a prior webinar back in October of last year, we talk a lot about capital projects from a plan and design. There's a procure and build phase. Then there's the commissioning of those assets into operation. And then that commissioning is really the handover to your everyday operational staff. And then obviously the maintenance guys, or the maintenance organization, maintains those assets on an ongoing basis. At some point, end of life, perhaps 30, 40, 50 years down the road, there's a decommissioning strategy that needs to take place. So that's really the holistic nature, if you want to look at it that way. When I start to look at the operate and maintain, there's really the again, there's two organizations in there. It's almost a sub-organization when I start to observe the current as is. There's the operations guys who keep everything running on a daily basis, keep the machines, the plants, the assets running safely. And then there's the maintenance guys who go out and, again, maintain performance of those assets, look for reliability, and so forth. And then the backdrop here is really the life cycle costs. And I want to make a note, life cycle costs are very different than the actual maintenance costs themselves. Certainly a big picture, so when I think about the title there, strategic, it's looking at the strategic life of the asset, the strategic cost of the asset, and that goes back to certainly the corporate plans and strategy around my return on investment, my return on assets, and if I do plan to put tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in some investments, what am I getting back on a year-over-year basis in terms of my return? Okay, so that's sort of in a nutshell, how we view enterprise asset management. So certainly much more complex. And then the next slide I'm going to take you to is probably even a bit more complex. However, I do want to set the stage for an internationally accepted standard that recently just was released, the ISO 55000 framework of standards. And again, some of you might be familiar with it. I know a lot of our clients are currently asking us about ISO 55000, what it means, what's the impact, how many people are adopting it, the usefulness, what it really talks to. Does it talk to the technology? Does it talk to the finance side? Does it talk to... So certainly lots of questions around that. I think it's a very valid concern. But effectively, if I could sum it up, this recently released standard is a very structured way to examine the components that make up strong asset management strategy or strong asset management system. When I say an asset management system, I'm not talking about technology systems, but really I like to think of it as the ecosystem within the context of the organization. And this standard, by the way, can be applied to all asset classes, all types, and all sizes of organizations. So something there to think about. It's certainly very scalable. So from a structural standpoint, there's seven dimensions that I won't need to go into, or don't have time to go into, but if you look at sort of the seven dimensions: organizational context, leadership, planning, support, operations, and so forth. It makes your asset management framework very, very robust and very comprehensive. So again, I won't go through this framework because it could be anything from a day-long presentation to even a week-long discussion, and certainly lots of good debate, lots of good discussion going on around the world, as this was just released a couple of months ago. Suffice to say, this is really the big picture, and these are all the strategic components that organizations need to think about. So when I look at leadership, there's support components like information, documentation, technology, and then there's certainly continuous improvement activity. So very similar to the different frameworks, and the one framework I just showed you previously was really the PwC way of looking at things, and we leverage a lot of the learnings, a lot of the frameworks in terms of the ISO framework. As we talk to clients about asset management strategy, and how to roll these frameworks out. And certainly there's no one size that fits all, but certainly there's certainly a customized approach that's suitable. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to the next section, which is really what are the risks involved as a result of poor strategy and execution. So when I look at enterprise asset management, I certainly look at it from a functional perspective. So again, from the roots of maintenance, now we're looking at asset management, we're sort of drawing a picture of the asset life cycle. And then we say there's the trifecta or tripod of performance, risk, and cost, and how do we manage that? So again, a lot of our clients traditionally come to us from a value perspective. How do I squeeze more of the lemon? And I think the example that I showed before is how do we maintain our risk profile, and how do we maintain certainly the reliability of the performance of the asset, but at the same time lower costs. I mean, that's no surprise to all utilities that we've worked with. That's going to be the key thing. So in the other way of looking at how do we drive value. The one thing I want to turn our attention to, given this session here, is talk about the risk side of management, asset management. And from a utilities perspective, obviously risk is a key part, probably more important than the value equation when you consider public safety. So this next slide, again, a lot of these will look familiar to most of you on the phone. And the best thing is, where assets fail, the outcomes can be anything from, like I said, a light bulb burning out, to people slipping on ice, to something that's catastrophic. So you see on these well-documented cases, and Fukushima is probably the closest one to us and happened just sort of 2.5 years ago. These are extreme, but they're very, very possible. And again, similar severity outcomes could result from something as simple as the wrong maintenance procedure that's been carried out, a wrong maintenance procedure or wrong maintenance instructions that have been carried out on something as simple as a pressure release valve. If you think about it in that perspective, certainly lots to think about from an asset management perspective, and something very, very critical that organizations need to get a very strong hold on. And I might add that I'm actually quite impressed with the utility sector. I do a lot of work across all sectors where asset-intensive industries are found, oil and gas, mining. Quite impressed with utilities, and partly because they're a regulated industry. A lot of utilities have taken risk management and risk mitigation as a top priority for obvious reasons. Okay, this next slide is, again, from a value perspective and what impacts value. So again, I want to sort of talk a little bit about two sides of the coin, right? So two sides of the coin, you've got the value side, the other side is the risk side. Effectively, what I wanted to talk about in this slide is that we can look at each one of these levers, strategy, structure, people, process, technology, data, and so forth, and we can work on each one of these. And I would say no company is good at all of these. Every company has some work to do. They all vary in level of maturity. But if we look at each of these levers, we can start to work on these levers sometimes singularly, sometimes in parallel, sometimes in an integrated fashion. But we can create value. We can impact value and create value and improve value from an organization's perspective and a delivery perspective, what a utility delivers to its consumers and its shareholders. On the flip side, we also see risk. So certainly from a risk perspective, if you're not doing some of these things fully well or in an integrated fashion or aligned with each other, there certainly is the risk impact and risk profile that increases in some cases. So I think, for example, the earlier example, remember I had mentioned sort of the failure to properly perform maintenance procedures on a pressure release valve. Those are examples of control points that could be a lack of updated instructions, as I mentioned before, and that one is really found in lack of updated instructions would be in the data, sort of the governance and process of data management. So again, who's updating instructions, maintenance instructions, who's updating them, who's maintaining them, and who's ensuring that those instructions are accurate, especially as you start to bring new assets or new projects start to commission new assets into operation. Are those documents, is that information there, is it accurate? Replacement parts, again, I did talk a little bit about supply chain. Does that actually come into play? And are people looking at that? So that's really the data side of things. There could also be a lack of end-to-end visibility on the process. So if you go to the top right, swim lane accountability, end-to-end visibility. If I take a look at the process from A to Z and all of the different handoffs, there could be an example of, if I need to perform work, I need to get sign-off or instructions, special instructions, or special information from the engineering group. Is that process clearly laid out for the asset management staff, the field workers? Is it clearly laid out for the engineering folks that they need to contribute at any point in time when they do a specific maintenance task? And is there that accountability from a maintenance perspective, an operations perspective, an engineering perspective, et cetera, and do we have that visibility from beginning to end? Sounds fairly simple, but it's actually a very, very large gap from what we've seen, especially when technology comes into play and we start to implement enabling technology, and a number of our clients are going through that process right now, implementing enabling technology, not clearly understanding the processes, but trying to design processes partly with what the technology drives and partly with what they're currently doing. What we're finding is that there is no clear visibility or accountability. So again, in the case I just presented before, if you're not getting engineering sign-off or if you're not involving the engineering group, for example, there could be a risk that's involved. And again, I also mentioned before sort of tribal knowledge. When you look at sort of the maintenance groups that we've seen as a firm, a lot of them work off of tribal knowledge, and I've done this before. I've maintained this equipment under my watch for the last 10 years. I'm going to continue maintaining it the way I see fit or the way I think is right. And again, that doesn't work well when you start to look at sort of the integrated, holistic system. It doesn't work well when you're looking at from a regulatory compliance perspective, and it doesn't work well certainly from a risk perspective looking at personal safety. So there's certainly that part. When I look at sort of the people side of things, the training one is an important one, or role or skill one, where there's certainly role mismatch or role alignment between maintenance staff or performing maintenance procedures. Some maintenance procedures obviously are more complex than others. Some require more experience than others. And again, from a lot of the situations that we've seen, a lot of risk involved where you have maintenance folks going out, getting assigned a maintenance work order and not really knowing or having done that before, knowing the full extent of safety precautions or risks or hazardous materials and so forth. So again, part and parcel of how well prepared are the people in understanding and being trained for the job, how well are they aligned to the job that they're supposed to do, how well is their role or alignment in using the tools. So I have tool enablement there. How well are they enabled with the right tools? And do they know how to use the right tools, right? So there's calibration tools and there's implementation tools and so forth. So how well are they trained there? So that's that piece. There's certainly the structural piece. So again, is the right organization supporting the operations and that asset base? Ratio of roles, how many managers, supervisors, field technicians, hands on the wrench folks do you have? What's the ratio of roles, and are people getting overloaded with work orders? And as you start to bring in, the more creative sort of compensation methods where you're going on a per job basis, we start to see a lot of give and take in terms of people going through the right safety procedures, getting the right documentation, getting the right sign-off, getting the right procedures, following process A, B, C, D before you do E. And again, as people start to go to a piecemeal maintenance perspective or outsource basis. So certainly lots to think about there. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of a sense that these are areas where we could look for value and make some operational improvements. But they're also, flip around the mirror image, is I could look at each one of these and I could probably identify a number of areas where risk comes into the equation. So again, the list goes on, and we could probably talk about it for many, many different cycles. And I do actually bring in one example in the next section. Okay, so that's really strategy and execution impacting value and risk. The next section here is again taking a different lens. This is our PwC Connected Power and Utilities model. It takes into consideration all the components we saw in the last several slides, and it factors it neatly into a capability lens. So when we take a look at influencing levers, making changes, working with people, process, technology, structure, data, et cetera, then we need to talk about what are the capabilities from an organizational perspective. And again, no different if you're looking at a value equation or if you're looking at the risk equation. It comes down to the capabilities that the organization has in-house and then how to use those capabilities. So let me take you through the diagram and then maybe we'll draw some conclusions. So what you see on the left side, what we talked about, strategy, structure, people, process, technology, data, are really the levers that we talked about moving and changing. When you look at sort of the middle three circles, that's really your performance, risk, and expenditure or cost side. When we look at the areas in terms of what makes a utility tick, the assets and the employees are really probably the most key because those are obviously resources to make things happen and assets that you're working on or you're extracting value from. And that's really our perspective on EAM. More importantly, the capabilities are on the right-hand side. And if you remember that sort of the three buckets that I told you about, the areas where we can impart influence, asset management, work management, and performance management. Those are sort of the three out of the four buckets. The fourth one is how you monitor the network, how you manage outages, for example. So we won't get into that piece. That's more of an operational. So from an asset management perspective, asset management, the strategic part of it, I mean, that's all the different things that are listed there. So technical information, failure and condition analysis, performance management, standards management, maintenance management, investment planning. So these, again, as I mentioned before, these are the big picture pieces. And then you've got the work management, more tactical. How do you forecast work? How do you integrate capital projects with program management and start to get, a lot of the same people doing working on capital projects versus maintenance work? The core work management process, as I mentioned to you before, some of you are familiar with sort of plan, schedule, execute, and so forth. And then, of course, the performance management side. So those are capabilities which, again, it's more of a systematic view for us to take a look at an organization and say, your asset management capability currently sits today at level X. Where you'd like to go is level Y, and there are some improvement activities you need to go through to get yourself to that future state. And that future state hopefully links back to the levers you want to push. And then it's it goes back to that cascading diagram where we have strategy, then you have objectives, plans, and so forth. So that's really the framework which we use, and certainly something that you guys on the phone can certainly use. When you're taking a look and sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, let's look at the holistic nature of our asset management function. Okay. So we're up to the last section. So let me take you through sort of identifying risk and controls. So again, as I mentioned to you before, there's a value equation, there's also the risk side of things. Taking that capabilities framework that you saw in the last slide, we circle sort of the asset performance management. And again, from a risk perspective, there's always going to be what are your objectives in managing risk, and what are the risks, and what are the controls. So from an objectives perspective, our asset performance, we want assets to provide reliable service. Okay, so what that means, you as an organization need to determine what is reliable service. The next one here is, risk. So what are the 2 risk points? And these are just examples. There could be 5, 6, 7 risk points that are associated with those assets providing reliable service. In this first example, the first risk is preventative maintenance work is not done when required. The second risk is preventative maintenance work is not done correctly. So the first control point of when the work is not done when required, obviously when you thought sort of the catastrophic outcomes, if you're not maintaining something, you lead that asset to the risk of failure. And then, of course, reliable service comes in as a consequence. The control point is preventive maintenance schedule is measured by schedule compliance. If we have a schedule that's published with all of our preventative maintenance activities, you can actually take a look at that schedule and look at compliance week over week, month over month, and say how many scheduled maintenance activities have we missed. And if we haven't missed anything, and that preventive maintenance program or activity has been designed properly, that control effectively mitigates that risk. Likewise, on risk number 2, preventive maintenance work not done correctly. So again, control point detailed and accurate preventative maintenance instructions are available and issued. And again, I tried to use the same theme example through the last couple of slides, the whole governance and process of data. So those preventive maintenance instructions are not available or issued to the right people. There's a control point or control failure that preventive maintenance work is not done correctly. I suppose there's another point around, the maintenance worker is trained and understanding that they need to go and seek out these instructions on a regular basis and not go on his tribal knowledge or how they've done things in the past. So that's really risk number 2, control point number 2. And when you take a look at sort of the risk consequences, I think the end consequence is, failure of the asset resulting in service disruption. And this leads to, those consequences you see there, decreased customer service, impact of reputation of the organization, and certainly health, safety, and environmental impact if you've got an asset that spills, contaminated chemicals and so forth. Obviously, from a utility perspective, if you're not supplying the service, you're not getting the revenue that you charge for that service. And again, the other part to look at from a consequence perspective is if an asset fails, it often doesn't just fail on its own. It fails and it could impact other assets around it, or sort of the asset system, and again, increased repair costs. So from a repair cost, it could be additional operating expenses to repair the surrounding assets or surrounding pieces of equipment or parts, what have you. In an extreme case, again, if it fails and it's beyond repair, there could be, again, service disruption, but more importantly, there's a CapEx impact. So those are sort of the risk consequences. Hopefully, we've painted a picture on how enterprise asset management can impact both value, but at the same time risk, and how it plays into a number of the utilities. I'm sort of giving you a framework for operating and evaluating your own asset management situation, the current situation, maybe where you want to go in the future. I know a lot of the clients that we currently work with today, they've asked a lot of questions around these topics, and again, I've tried to give a sense or a flavor, and as I mentioned in, I think, Section 3, how EAM has evolved. It's a whole science unto its own now, and we could spend days or months or even years talking about asset management and so forth. So that ends sort of my brief introduction on enterprise asset management in the utility sector.
Thank you very much, Walter, for providing us with your insights and perspectives. We're now going to move on to our Q&A segment. So just as a quick reminder, you can type your questions into the chat box on your screen. If you click on the green tag at the top of your screen, it should drop down. So we have received a few questions over the course of the presentation. So I will just pick a few here. So the first one that's come through reads, do we see internal audit functions looking at EAM programs? I can actually kick off fielding this one, Walter.
Yeah.
Since I actually come from an internal audit background, the last thing we want to hear is tribal knowledge. So I'll say that right off the bat. But I think the quick answer to this question is yes. We see a number of internal audit departments adding EAM reviews to their plans. And us folks in internal audit have worked very closely with our friends down in the EAM consulting group on a number of engagements, internal audit engagements. There are a number of strategic risks that are impacted by the maintenance and management of assets. Availability has a significant impact on revenues. Outage management impacts operational efficiency as well as costs. And preventive maintenance typically has a significant environmental health and safety component. So, and we've seen these risks translated into internal audits in a variety of areas that include, the granular transaction-based reviews internal audits sometimes get involved in, as well as broader program-level reviews. Recent examples include outage management audits, focusing on how the planning and timing of outages is coordinated between ops and maintenance. We've also been involved in a number of work management system audits. Again, looking at the transaction level areas as well as, such as safe work planning, coding and prioritization of work orders, as well as some broader reviews looking at how do work management systems align with regulatory requirements such as hydro dam safety. It also helps internal audit groups evaluate roles and responsibilities within maintenance organizations, and also conducted reviews of asset master data and taken deep dives on metrics around availability, reliability, and also conducted reviews of preventive and predictive maintenance plans. So I think the simple answer is yes, and there's definitely a great deal of interest in EAM from an internal audit perspective. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Walter.
A couple of examples where I was involved, where I've seen internal audits is certainly the technology side. So again, very relevant topic. Organizations are implementing technology as we speak, either from a core maintenance function or work management perspective, as well as field enablement. So from a technology perspective, I've seen internal audits involved in understanding sort of the flow of, do we have the requirements clearly stated? Do we have the system designed based on those requirements and satisfying those requirements? Have we tested, and are the tests that we do for system testing, are they aligned with the design? And also going back to, do they satisfy those system requirements? And as we roll this out, do we have the training that's aligned with how the system is designed and how we've constructed it, and then how we go back to the users for requirements, and are we training them on the usage of this? And then more importantly, as it goes live, or before it goes live, the test there from the internal audit controls perspective is the governance. How do we govern this whole implementation? And then how do we govern the maintenance of technology? So again, from a governance perspective, once the system goes live, it's not just the technology, it works, great, but now it's the data. The data that runs behind the system and the data that's allowed you to perform the work, is that data relevant and is that accurate? So again, one of the examples I gave is if data is out of sync. A lot of times assets are installed on an as-built or as-installed basis. They're a little bit different from design, which is not to say that it's not okay. There's certainly the management of change process. But what's not okay is that no one talks about it and no one documents it, and it doesn't make its way back into sort of master data or the technical data, technical information archive for people to look at and reference back. And again, that I think is where internal audit gets a little sensitive, and rightly so, because when you're we've got assets that are installed that are different from design, you put the public in danger, and you also put the workers in danger. So that's where I've seen internal audit sort of take a key role from a technology perspective. They just want to make sure that sort of everything is tied together nicely, and that what we set out to do in rolling that technology out is actually what we've accomplished and what we've put into the hands of the people using the system.
Great. There's a few questions actually came in around the use of data analytics while Walter, you were speaking, and I think I can kick off that discussion and then maybe hand it back over to you. Again, this is from where I'm coming from, it's largely from an internal audit perspective, but we've done some engagements where we've looked at the data that's collected as part of the front asset management system to actually identify some specific areas where maintenance may not be, maintenance programs may not be as effective as the business thought it may be. There's particular examples where if there's a certain number of pieces of equipment that transmit data over to a centralized database, we'd actually brought in our data analytics group, and we looked at the data transmissions over the course of the year. We actually noted there was a number of instances where the data was not being transmitted. And for regulatory purposes, there was actually a requirement for this, this data to be collected and trended and monitored, and that would actually drive the work management process and the maintenance over that equipment. So through data analytics, we actually identified certain days where the equipment was not functioning or just not transmitting, and that actually created some regulatory concern for this client.
Okay. Yeah, and the one thing I want to add there from an asset management perspective, we're seeing some more sophisticated and more mature clients. They're starting to use sort of raw data, analyzing that data to take a look. And I might have mentioned this earlier in the presentation, where we're looking at reliability, we're looking at risk, we're looking at criticality. So organizations are starting to look at risk outcomes. So an asset fails, you've got a portfolio of assets, A to Z. Those assets might fail. What is the impact to the organization? There's analysis around that, and then there's the quantification of the impact to the organization. So again, catastrophic impact versus a light burning out. And then there's the likelihood. So again, quantification of likelihood of something failing. When you take a look at sort of likelihood and impact, you've got a risk matrix or risk portfolio. You can translate that into, and what our clients have done, they translated that into criticality. What is critical? So assets that have a high likelihood and a high impact of failure, are on the critical list. And if they're on the first priority critical list, they want to create, and that's where the useful knowledge comes in, they want to create more meaningful maintenance tactics to avoid those situations or to mitigate those situations. If they're avoiding and mitigating those situations, they're actually using that data to be smarter about how they deploy maintenance tactics and how they deploy maintenance activities, and also how they deploy maintenance personnel to go and execute on this. So that's where we've seen clients use raw data to make smarter decisions and not get around, not fall into the trap of, we built this thing, the manufacturer said you need to maintain it in this way over this life, and it might be time-based, for example. It's outcome-based.
there's a few questions that came through around the ISO 55000 standard that you talked about. So one being, is ISO 55000 being adopted by utilities? And also, there's a question about the PAS 5. So I don't know if
PAS 55.
PAS 55. So if you
so PAS 55, and so this is testing a bit of my knowledge back. So PAS 55, I believe, is the British version of publicly available standards, and that's really morphed into, again, when I say British, publicly available standards, that's kind of morphed into ISO 55000, which is, again, International Standards Organization. So this organization has ISO 14000, ISO 9000. ISO 55000 was, again, the culmination or the collaboration of multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, and how they view asset management and creating. So it's taking really effectively a lot of the foundation or a lot of PAS 55 concepts and creating more of a global or an international view of it. And that's really ISO 55000. So again, the culmination of that, the output, is summed up in that framework that I showed you earlier. So that's how the two relate. The question of ISO 55000 being adapted by utilities, that's a pretty new, it's a new concept. So the question's fairly open-ended there. I can tell you a lot of utility organizations are thinking about it. They're aware of it, especially since they're in a regulated environment. So from a regulated environment, chances are you can almost place bets that there's going to be a framework by which organizations need to comply against. So not to say that it is in place right now, but again, when I talk about regulated versus unregulated, higher chance that they're going to comply with some type of standard. Now that standard happens to be ISO 55000, a lot of utilities are thinking about it. They're asking us questions. They're talking about, what is the standard? How does it apply? And do you have any other clients who have implemented it? And what are the pros and cons? And what are the sort of the benefits, the financial benefits or the risk benefits or any type of benefits? So they're certainly asking a lot of questions. I can tell you a number of our clients, both north and south of the border, in the U.S. and in Canada, some have gone down the path of implementing certain parts of it. Others are sort of taking a bit of a wait and see approach to see what their peers are doing. And some other clients that we've talked to are taking bits and pieces and using that as a framework to help guide their strategy and help guide the rollout. So again, it's always good to use a framework to say this is what I need to focus on and this is what I don't need to focus on. So that sort of hopefully answers your question. Again, it's fairly new. It's only been introduced in the last couple of months.
Okay, great. There's another question here. From an organizational perspective, where should asset management reside? In other sense, I guess, who should oversee it?
Okay.
Where does asset management, who owns it in the organization?
No, that's a great question. Because as I mentioned, maintenance used to be sort of the purview or the owners with the operations. So the operations guys operate the assets on a daily basis, as I mentioned before. The maintenance guys used to work for them, and they used to maintain the assets and maintain the equipment. They used to have, and I'll get into supply chain sort of in a moment, because I think there's a very strong relationship. So historically, maintenance has resided underneath operations. We ask the question, where should it reside, and who should oversee it? We often see asset management being considered at the C level for all the variety of reasons that I just went through over the last 45 minutes. That it is impacting the bottom line. It does impact overall life cycle costs, so return on investment, return on assets. Again, asset intensive industry, key metric is return on assets. And if you look at sort of the outcomes of poor asset management, catastrophic failure, obviously your board of directors, your stakeholders, government, etc., they're going to care a lot. So asset management really should be at, and leading practices that it is at the C level. There is visibility at the C level, and there's a voice at the table. However, problem that we run into today is that maintenance and operations they've traditionally there's been a lot of friction between the two groups. Maintenance may not get the voice at the table at the C level if they're just talking maintenance, and hopefully what we've got across today is that asset management is so much more than just maintenance. And asset management really should be looked at in the same way as core operations. It's really a collaboration effort between operations. So operations, what you do on an everyday basis and how we do it, there should be asset management or maintenance view in there as well as the engineering view. I also mentioned supply chain, which is important because that's sort of the in-between. So supply chain has often been seen as sort of the cost center. We need to buy materials, we need to store those materials, and we need to transport those materials to a job site. It's a cost center, therefore procurement and inventory traditionally has been part of finance. And certainly finance has a table at the C-suite. But when we take a look at asset management, a key enabler of asset management is the supply chain in itself. So again, it makes sense that you've got sort of the three things working from an operations, maintenance, and supply chain perspective, all at the C-suite, all at the same level, and it's setting goals at the same time, and they're also going after those goals with the same group of resources, same pool of resources. They're all still going after those same objectives. So hopefully that answers the question. And again, whether it's a double hat, and some organizations that we've worked with, they're at the C-suite, they've got a double hat with the VP of operations, VP of engineering, and traditionally that's what we'll see a lot of in utilities is the double or triple hat from those types of executives.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Walter. That unfortunately does conclude the amount of time we have for questions. Now, there was definitely a number of questions that came through, that we were not able to address in this session, but we have collected them, and, we will be getting back to people for those specific questions. So thank you very much for all your participation. I'd like to just hand it back to Arun for some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Mark. So that concludes our presentation today. I'd like to thank Walter and Mark for being here and for sharing their insights. I hope this provided you with some context and perspective around EAM and its relevance to the Internal Audit Board. I would also like to thank you for participating in our webinar today, and we hope to see you at our next Power and Utilities webinar. Have a good day, everyone.